Welcome everyone to our second keynote of the Great Mediation Conference. Welcome, Professor Vale. We're delighted to have you today with us. And I am delighted to be the moderator for this session, in which we will have Professor Chris Vale giving a talk, followed by a conversation with four panelists. Before I introduce Prof. Vale, let me preface this conversation by saying something that touched me deeply today, and it is in some forms related to the topics we have been discussing over the conference and that we will be discussing during this keynote. I am right now in Colombia, where police brutality against social protests has been escalating, killing over 30 civilians, disappearing over 300 more, and with more than 1,000 people wounded. So this is, to say the least, horrible. I wanted you to know that this is happening. I know this is not only happening in Colombia. We need to de-escalate this violence and look actively and urgently for paths to social change. I say this, and I say that this is related to our conversation in this conference because the events in Colombia today have been marked by the character of protests in the digital age, with new forms of organizing and headless in many ways, as some of the panelists have described, with new forms of internet shutdowns in some regions of the country to block mobilizations, tweets inciting hate by the right-wing leaders that have combined political practices, as I described in my presentation, and content moderation by the platforms taking down tweets that incite violence. In light of these events, I think our conference gains relevance, and we are fortunate to have during this session someone that has been thinking deeply about these issues. Professor Chris Vale research and new book shed light on these pressing matters. Chris Vale is professor of sociology and public policy at Duke University, where he directs the Polarizing lab. He studies political tribalism, extremism, and social psychology using data from social media and tools from the emerging fields of computational social science. A Guggenheim Fellow and Carnegie Fellow, Chris' research appears in leading journals such as Science, the Proceedings of National Academy of Science, and the American Journal of Sociology. His 2015 book, Terrified: How Anti-Muslim Fringe Organizations Became Mainstream, received 3 awards and resulted in an invitation to address the 2016 Democratic National Convention. Professor Vale regularly lectures to our audiences in government, business, and the nonprofit sector. He also consults with social media platforms struggling to combat polarization. He is passionate about building the fields of computational social sciences. He is the editor of the Oxford University Press series in computational social sciences and the co-founder of the Summer Institute in computational social sciences, which are free training events designed to introduce junior scholars to the fields that are held currently in a range of universities around the world each year. He also serves on the advisory committee to the National Science Foundation, Social Behavioral Economic Science Directorate, and helped create Duke's interdisciplinary data science program. So with that, thank you so much, Professor Vale. We are delighted to have you here today with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Nicholas, and thank you all for coming and for having me. I want to begin by apologizing for my absence from so much of the conference so far. As Nicholas just mentioned, I'm on this NSF panel, and unfortunately, although I committed to this first, they scheduled a 2-day horrific 8-hour Zoom meeting that overlaps almost exactly with this event. So I hope we get a chance to connect afterwards, because I'd really love, I've seen the program, the talks look amazing, and what you all have done, especially given that this is graduate student led, it's just phenomenal, and congratulations on putting together such an interesting conference here. So I'll go ahead and share my screen here. As Nicholas said, I'd love to tell you about my new book. It's called Breaking the Social Media Prism. And I love the way that Nicholas framed, the urgency of figuring out these problems related to digital media and political polarization, you know, it's so clear that, you know, well, one, this is a problem in so many places, but also two, that we need to understand places like Colombia much better than we do. And so I have to also begin by apologizing for a very American-centric book. Most of what I'll have to say today is about the US, but I'll try to, wherever I can, make some connections to these important, very important international cases. This is a bit of an odd book. It's like no book I've written before. It has a few different missions. The first is to try to explain how social media is shaping political polarization. The second is to try to provide some correctives to computational social science using qualitative methods. So I'll talk a lot and emphasize today a lot a qualitative field experiment that I've been working on with our team at the Polarization Lab for about the last 2.5 years. And then it also has a public mission. So a lot of what I'm trying to do is chart a course for public sociology, you know, worrying that too often, especially in cultural and media sociology, that we aren't engaging enough, and that we could have more impact if we did. So I'll try to hit on all of those points, but I'm going to focus more, you know, knowing my audience here, on the kind of intellectual contribution. But if you'd like to hear more about that, I'd love to talk about that as well. Okay, so you know, political polarization in the United States is something that is very widespread. Obviously, you know, we hear about it all the time in the news. And you know, one of the most concerning developments, I think, has been a rise in what's often called affective polarization, or negative attitudes between Republicans and Democrats, independent of what they believe. So this graph is from a paper I recently published with some colleagues, shows that basically out-party hate has come to displace in-group love. So, you know, we tend to care more about taking the other side down than promoting our own side. And, you know, this is, of course, very concerning development, and lots of people are searching for explanations. And I think the story of political polarization has deep historical roots that predate social media. We might point to factors like, you know, the collapse of the Soviet Union, which perhaps provided a common enemy that kept intergroup tensions at bay, the market segmentation of the media, especially for this crowd, so the rise of cable news, you know, work by Sarah Sobrai and others that shows so convincingly how there have been new markets for outrage and incivility. You know, certain political strategies from both parties that probably resulted in these divisions, polarizing leaders, lots of different explanations. But the one that I'm going to focus on today is social media. So this is one of the kind of ubiquitous social network diagrams you may see in a lot of talks about social media. Here, you know, as I mouse over these different folks, you can see these are elected officials. And if they're colored red, they're Republicans. If they're colored blue, they're Democrats. And this is a Twitter network, so the lines describe people who are following each other on Twitter. And as you can see, no matter kind of what category we look at, you'll see the same clustering according to party. So you'll see the Democrats tend to cluster with the Democrats, the Republicans tend to cluster with the Republicans, and so on and so forth. By the way, a lot of the tools and visualizations and interactive visualizations I'll be demoing are available for you to check out on polarizationlab.com if you're interested. So basically, you know, the idea of the echo chamber provides a really neat explanation for some unexpected events, I think, in the US and abroad too. You know, I remember in 2017, you know, being very surprised by the election of Donald Trump, or say the Brexit referendum, and thinking that, you know, perhaps the reason I didn't see this is because, you know, I follow a lot of left-leaning college professors, and perhaps I wasn't just seeing the palpable enthusiasm for people like Trump or Brexiteers in Britain, and this might explain why you know, I had such narrow vision. And of course, that's the real concern with social media echo chambers, is that they might create a kind of myopia where we only can see one side of the story and not the other side, or we fail to connect with other people or realize our kind of shared humanity and all these types of things. And of course, if we think back to the social psychological tradition here, the work of Gordon Allport and would suggest that, intergroup contact has the potential under the right circumstances to reduce intergroup tensions and prejudice. So one might expect then that taking people outside their echo chambers would produce moderation. And so in 2017, I'll briefly describe an old study, and then I'm going to focus more on newer studies that I describe in the book. But to set those studies up, I need to describe the somewhat surprising result from this first study that we did in 2017. So we recruited about 1,200 Republicans and Democrats to complete a fairly lengthy survey about their views, asking them questions about things like climate change, racial prejudice, their media consumption, their contact with members of the other party, lots of other kind of indicators of both their views and their media habits. And then about a week later, by the way, I should say these are all Twitter users who identified with either the Republican or the Democratic Party. So there's no independence and there's no analysis of other platforms here. 1 week later, we randomized people to a treatment condition where they received a seemingly unrelated invitation to follow a bot that they were told, or automated Twitter account that would retweet 24 messages each day. They weren't told about the content of the bot's tweets, but they were told that they could earn up to $24 for correctly answering questions about the content of the bot's tweets. Then at the end of the month, we sent them the same survey that we sent them at the beginning of the month. And of course, the interesting intervention here was that we exposed Republicans to a bot that tweeted messages from Democratic opinion leaders, so people like journalists, elected officials, but also advocacy organizations and media organizations. And then we exposed Democrats in the study's treatment condition to Republicans. And so the idea was to try to ask a question, how would exposure to opposing views shape people's political attitudes, particularly their attitudes about issues. So we place everybody on a liberal to conservative index, which has been popularized by the literature. There was a somewhat surprising result of this study. So when we looked at the effect of following a bot that exposed people to the other side for 1 month, what we discovered is that on average, no one became more moderate. So here you're looking at the results for Democrats and for Republicans, and these are different levels of compliance. So essentially, this is how many questions the people were able to answer about the content of our bot's tweets. If they could answer all of them, we considered them fully compliant. If they answered only one of them, we considered them minimally compliant. And this refers to people who were just assigned to the study's treatment condition, independent of whether they actually complied with the treatment we were trying to give them. So what you can see here is that Republicans very clearly become more conservative. This is a pretty large effect. It's about a standard deviation. And Democrats become slightly more liberal, though the effect isn't statistically significant. And so you can read more about this piece, which came out in PNAS in 2018. And basically, we had some kind of interesting opportunities, I think, with the data we had. We had social media data linked to survey data, which is somewhat unusual. Usually people only study the social media data, or they only study survey data. And there are lots of interesting things about combining them. For example, we can run like text analysis on the tweets people produce or network analysis on how their networks are changing each day, and understand these in the context of a confidential survey. And we used many fancy techniques to try to make sense of this finding, this somewhat counterintuitive finding. It wasn't completely unexpected. There was some precedent that would suggest these types of effects were possible. But we used the fanciest machine learning models you can think of. Everything we could throw at it, including all sorts of language-based models trying to tease out things like emotions and things like that. And ultimately, what we concluded is we couldn't understand why this effect happened. And there were some suggestive things in the data. Maybe people were showing more emotions over time as they were exposed to the bot more, but really it was inconclusive. And so what I've been up to for the last 2 or 3 years is trying to make sense of that effect through a follow-up study. So in 2018, we repeated the exact same experiment. So people once again followed bots, and they once again completed the same type of survey that I described. But instead of studying 1,200 people, we did 154 interviews with Republicans and Democrats. These are longitudinal interviews and open-ended qualitative interviews that were conducted before and after they followed these bots. And the goal was really to try to both understand how people were experiencing this exposure to countervailing information, but also to kind of fit it into their bigger picture. We asked people questions like, why did you start using social media, or when did you start using social media? Tell us about the last time you used social media. Tell us about the last 3 times you used social media. And then gradually our interviews kind of worked into political topics. So we asked people, for example, to describe their earliest memory about politics. And then we asked them a series of questions about how their political views had evolved. And then we were able to ask them the same types of questions in our quantitative survey in a qualitative format. So we asked them questions about climate change, racial injustice, a number of different issues. Then the other interesting thing we were able to do is to focus on events that were unfolding during this qualitative field experiment. So these were things like the campfire in California, the caravan of migrants which assembled at the US-Mexico border in 2018, the murder of an African-American security guard by police, the execution of Jamal Khashoggi, the Washington Post journalist, and many other kind of similar high-profile events, of course, many involving President Trump as well. We also asked them a lot of questions towards the end of the interview about how social media shaped their political views. Not directly, we asked them a lot of questions about, particular political messages they've seen on social media, if they had seen any. We asked them questions like, has social media ever changed your mind about anything? We tried to get to know them very well before we exposed them to the study's bots. And then the follow-up interview, we really asked almost the same questions because we didn't want to create any kind of interviewer effects that might have primed people to talk about the information we were trying to expose them to. We wanted it to come up more naturally, and we actually we had a very systematic approach to rotating interviewers across different respondents in order to kind of give people the appearance that they were doing another interview with another person rather than following up with the same person. And also the interviewers were unaware of whether the respondents had been assigned to the treatment or control condition to kind of further increase the integrity of the design. There's a lot more on this qualitative field experiment research design, the appendix of my book. If you're interested in learning more, I'm happy to talk more about it. So, the really interesting thing was we were able to, of course, meet people as they were experiencing this exposure to the other side. And I'll just share a few stories from the qualitative fieldwork to motivate the rest of this talk. The first one that I describe in the book is a woman called Patty. And this is kind of an interesting case study because Patty is a 63-year-old woman from upstate New York. And she really was having a tough time at the point we first met her by interview. She had a pre-existing health condition. She didn't qualify for health insurance. She was unemployed. Her husband was underemployed. And when we began to ask her about politics, it was clear that primarily she used social media to follow celebrities and TV stars and didn't really care about politics very much. And this is, it's easy for us to forget, those of us who study politics or media, but most people are like Patty. The vast majority of people don't talk about politics on social media. Probably only about 5 or 6% of people ever talk about politics very much on social media. And so in that way, she's kind of a more typical American. When we asked her, about her earliest political memories, she gave us a long story about why she doesn't really like either party, but she feels slightly more attached to the Democratic Party. Interestingly, as we got to ask her about individual issues, we discovered that a lot of her views actually weren't really in line with the Democratic Party. So, for example, she was concerned that the United States had accepted too many immigrants. She worried immigrants constitute a cultural threat against the United States. She was worried about overtaxation. She had the perception that government redistribution was primarily benefiting minority group members and not poor white people like her. And so, when we began to think about exposing her to a bot that would retweet Republican messaging, she seemed like exactly the type of person who should respond to a Trump-style populism that emphasizes nativism, economic populism, and so on. And so, I thought, and I think the whole research team, when we were analyzing the data, thought, this should be, if anybody bucks the trend, it should be this woman, Patty. And surprisingly, we didn't see her move towards the right at all when we compared the pre and post interview, both qualitatively by creating codes for both the interviews and comparing them using both a combination of automated text analysis, but also close reading of the interviews, or the survey data. So once again, for each of these people, we have the survey data, their social media data, and now these interviews to kind of triangulate what's going on. And we saw her also, like other people in the original experiment, double down in her pre-existing views. So, when we followed up with her in the second interview, she was able to suddenly articulate liberal talking points on things like immigration. So she had strong views about the border wall. She still was somewhat concerned about immigration, but she had adopted a lot of then prominent liberal talking points about, the need for better technological infrastructure at the border and not a large border wall. She was suddenly talking about the earned income tax credit and how great that was and how it could have really helped people like her. I'm not going to overstate this. We didn't turn her into a defender of sanctuary cities or anything like that. And she certainly was not voting for Bernie Sanders or anything like that. But she was noticeably shifted to the left. And also noteworthy is that someone who hadn't engaged in political debate on social media at all was suddenly engaging in arguments, especially with Republicans, for the first time. And so all of these data kind of were in line with the previous finding. And so when we started to sift through her responses to the pre and post interview, the thing that was most striking is that she didn't mention the content of the bot's ideas at all. So, I think when we think about social media and the idea of echo chambers, and here I'm talking not necessarily about sociologists, but I mean publicly, if you think about Mark Zuckerberg or Jack Dorsey, they often suggest that social media is essentially creating a competition of ideas, and we need to make it free and open and expose ourselves to all sorts of ideas because there's a kind of natural, almost Habermasian ideal where or if you like John Stuart Mill, where ideas compete and there's a compete for better reasons, or explanations compete for better reasons, and in our analysis, it became so clear that social media is not a competition of ideas, it's a competition of identities. So essentially what we discovered, I think, is that taking Patty outside her echo chamber was more like introducing her to partisan warfare for the first time. And when she saw her side being attacked, she felt compelled to defend her identity and as a Democrat. And as this happened, she actually learned the facts in order to defend the identity, at least as far as we could tell by tracking her again online and off. And this is so interesting because I think the typical description is, you're exposed to some different type of information, you rationally evaluate it, you decide if you're going to accept it or not, and then your worldview evolves accordingly, right? That's the kind of Habermasian story. but the story that I developed and the explanation that I developed in the book kind of forefronts identity as filtering information. So identity guides the information search process rather than the other way around. So there's a number of other stories of people as they step outside their echo chamber in the book, including a very strong Trump supporter who we exposed to Democratic messaging for a month as well, and we essentially observed a similar process. Although for the very strong and committed Republican who I'm describing, we basically, instead of introducing her to partisan warfare, we kind of just turned up the dial, because paradoxically, her echo chamber kind of insulated her from the most extreme liberal views. And so once she was kind of encountering the liberal views, she essentially kind of found more targets to attack. And so in both cases, again, identity seemed to drive the response rather than this kind of classical information seeking idea. So this was a big, a kind of nice explanation, consistent with a lot of sociology. But really, as is so often the case with qualitative research, the goal wasn't simply to identify the mechanism of one finding, but also to generate inductively more new ideas about what was going on in this kind of understudied situation, which is people developing their political views through watching social media, and especially social media from the other side. And here, I basically was compelled to create a kind of new account of how social media is shaping identity, because once we had kind of discovered, or maybe not discovered, but once we had seen that identity was so particularly important in driving this response, the kind of obvious next question for a sociologist is, how is the social environment shaping the identity construction process? And that's where in the fourth chapter of the book, I kind of introduce a new model of social learning, what social psychologists often call social learning, but really it's embedded in my account in the work of Norbert Elias and Irving Goffman, Charles Horton Cooley. We know, sociologists discovered long ago, that identity results from a kind of process of social experimentation. Kai Erikson, many others, Sherry Turkle. Basically, we know that each day we kind of all present different types of identities, knowingly or unknowingly. And then we search for evidence in our social environment about what other people think of those identities. And then we tend to cultivate those identities that give us a sense of social status, or otherwise kind of make us feel good about ourselves. And so, this kind of all too human behavior, which is kind of good old fashioned sociology, I think the most interesting questions for me are about how the social environment is changing the process through which we cultivate identities that give us social status. And in the book, I offer basically two primary ways that social media is reshaping this process. The first is that it gives us unprecedented flexibility to experiment with a broader range of identities. So, we can be exactly ourselves online, or we can be fully anonymous, or at the very least, we can prevent selective accounts of ourselves, or we can be someone completely different, really in principle, thanks to the anonymity of many online platforms. And so we have unprecedented flexibility in kind of how the range of experimentation we can do with our identities. The second thing that I think social media has kind of profoundly reshaped is the process through which we monitor what other people think about our identities. So we have, like counts and follower counts, and, we have whole new vocabulary like getting ratioed. Particularly among younger people who are online in unprecedented numbers, this identity construction process, is really easily observed, especially in the teenage years. That social media, especially in an era of increasing social isolation, not only because of COVID, but before COVID, we're seeing social media become, we sort of like a giant mirror that we all use to try to understand our place in the world and each other. But the kind of core argument of the book is that it's not a mirror. It's more like a prism that refracts our identities and creates distortions in how we understand the social environment, which then create kind of sort of various types of self-fulfilling prophecies. So before talking about those, I just want to point out that, you know, the argument that I'm making is not that we all care a lot about status on social media. Clearly, many people don't care about status on social media, and some people care more than others. And so one of the interesting things that this qualitative data allowed us to do was to try to get some context of what motivates people to behave the way they do on social media. And basically, I divided this analysis in the book into two chapters. The first is about extremists or online trolls. And basically, what we discovered is that social media provides incentives for social outcasts to engage in status-seeking behavior on social media. So, like the exemplar of this in the book is a guy who I call Ray. And Ray is a kind of moderate conservative, or at least he describes himself that way when we first interviewed him. And you know, he's very polite, even deferential, kind of goes out of his way in the interview to criticize, you know, racism. He complained that, you know, so many people are arguing online, but they're probably all just losers who live with their parents. You know, he was pretty civil and you know, thoughtful, seemingly thoughtful person. So then when we went to look at his social media data, by the way, we did this with everyone's permission, that we used different dialogues to recruit people to different studies, so that people didn't know until after the study, when we debriefed them, that it was actually different teams of researchers looking at their data. We discovered that this guy Ray is essentially one of the biggest political trolls on the internet. You know, it's unspeakable stuff that he was doing, basically attacking particularly African-American Democratic leaders with, you know, carefully photoshopped memes that he was making every night, late into the evening. And so one of the really interesting puzzles from this you know, discovery in the book, which we saw many times, including among liberals, by the way, is that you know, what on earth inspires someone to be so kind of Janus-faced in these different social settings. And the theory that I develop in the book is that people like Ray, who we learned through the linked data in our survey, through our survey firm, is actually a underemployed man, middle-aged man who lives with his mother, more or less exactly the person he was complaining about earlier. Is that he's a social outcast. He lives in a very liberal city. He works in a very liberal profession, and social media, I think, provides him kind of like a refuge to gain the kind of social belonging that he's not gaining in his everyday life. And so, even though, you know, many might kind of say, well, the status he's gaining online is artificial, one of the other interesting and, you know, primarily driven by other kind of trolls. It actually, when we look over time at the kind of evolution of trolls, which we're able to do by going back in time with the social media data, we see that for a lot of them, one of the, you know, this actually is a deeply valued form of status. So in one part of the book, I describe how upset many of these people become when they are unfollowed by other people. Okay, I'm getting a little behind on time. So I'll just fast forward to the next chapter, which is on moderates and kind of why moderate people tend to disengage from social media. And in the book, I write about a conservative woman and her experiences of harassment by liberal political trolls and how those led her to kind of retreat from social media. There's also some stories of an African-American respondent and how political apathy can produce, even among moderates like this particular gentleman, can make it seem like moderates are invisible. And so the prism effect and the idea of the social media prism analogy is to communicate that you know, we see this preponderance of extremists who are engaging in the status-seeking behavior, and moderates tend to disengage because they derive their status from primarily offline sources, their work, their family, their colleagues, whatever it is. And for them, engaging in politics is actually a liability. It can threaten their livelihood, their families. You know, I write about people in the book who've experienced death threats. And by the way, if any of you are interested in this type of harassment of moderates, Sarah Soberai has a wonderful new book called Credible Threat, which focuses on gender-based harassment in this domain. But anyhow, so that's a whole other part of the book. But together, these two processes are kind of self-reinforcing. So we tend to see, we tend to confuse extremists with moderates. That's the kind of Prism effect that I describe in the book. So, you know, and this is backed up by some broader analysis of broader trends on Twitter. For example, 73% of the posts about politics on Twitter are probably generated by about 6% of Twitter users, and those 6% of Twitter users have unusually strong views. And there's a variety of data, including some newer data, that suggests that moderates seldom or never engage in political debate online. And so this creates the kind of perfect storm for, you know, the escalation of affective polarization, where people can misunderstand an extremist from the other side as a moderate from the other side. And that can make them feel more antagonistic to the other side, but also more apathetic about the prevalence of polarization more broadly. And so the book kind of goes on to, and here's the public facing part of the book that I'll kind of gloss over a little bit here. It discusses whether, you know, people should delete their social media accounts, and ultimately concludes this isn't a tenable solution, even though there's so much obvious bad in social media, primarily because social media is so embedded in our society, but secondarily because there's so much social isolation, particularly among Republicans and Democrats, and social media, like it or not, is becoming the only place where cross-party dialogues are happening, which is of course deeply disturbing, but also suggests that we really need to figure out how to fix social media if we're gonna fix polarization. So then the book, you know, given this, you know, the book also tries to correct some myths about polarization, and encourage the reader to conclude that most of the polarization we see on social media is human driven, and kind of scrutinizes a lot of the prevailing wisdom about echo chambers, foreign misinformation campaigns, and algorithmic radicalization, and suggests that it's actually how our own human psychology interacts with the structure of social media platforms that's producing this outcome. So the final chapter of the book, I give some prescription about how we can address these bottom-up trends, and how we can encourage moderation and discourage the spread of extremism. And the book also offers some tools from computational social science, apps, bots, quizzes, and other interactive tools that are on polarizationlab.com that allow people to try to see the social media prism and break the social media prism, meaning identify moderate people on the other side and boost moderation. But the final chapter of the book asks kind of bigger questions about how can we change social environments to social media environments to disrupt these status seeking and identity dynamics. And so it kind of asks the question in sociological terms, can we take status or identity out of the equation? And the way that we decided to approach this, you know, it's kind of a difficult thing to do on Facebook or Twitter. You can't really, you know, go to Facebook and say, hey, could you maybe remove people's identities from their profile for us for a month and see what happens, right? It's just not a tenable thing. But that also, I think, underscores a deeper problem with social media research, which is that, like, we don't understand the design principles of social media and how those shape human behavior. We just don't. We've been content to just accept the ad hoc, chaotic evolution of platforms like Facebook, from tools used by Harvard undergraduates to rate each other's physical attractiveness, into the, you know, the primary forum for democratic debate, which is, you know, absurd when you think about it. So the last chapter of the book asks this question, like, if we could redesign social media from scratch, how could we design better social media environments that would incentivize social cohesion, instead of the divisive kind of partisan warfare that we've all become accustomed to? And the way we tried to study this it may surprise you. So we wanted to study the role of anonymity, and anonymity gets a really bad rap like, the story of the Dr. Jekyll into Mr. Hyde character that I told suggests that people might say things in person that they would never say, or say things online that they would never say in person. And so, anonymity may remove the, social consequences of rude or uncivil behavior, and the interactive and facial cues that we all use to understand things like sarcasm and things like that. But on the other hand, anonymity also has the potential to encourage us to focus on the content of each other's ideas instead of our identities, or at least to allow us to share our identities selectively. And this has a few potentially promising dimensions. The first is that it may allow us to explore unpopular ideas outside of peer pressure. So, for example, a Republican who has concerns about whether voter fraud really happened might not want to make that statement on Twitter for fear of people from their own party criticizing them, or a liberal who's concerned about defunding the police might not want to make that statement because of concern about how they'd be judged by other Democrats. And so we wanted to explore the potential for anonymity to allow people to engage in dialogue about the content of ideas, but also because anonymity perhaps can level social hierarchies. So, if you're anonymous, if you're in an anonymous conversation, and let's say, people can't easily discern your race or your gender, and this creates the opportunity for potentially for people from underprivileged groups to exert more influence. So that was another thing we were interested in about anonymity, and we go a little bit deeper in that, but because I'm running out of time, I'll simply describe the final study in the book, which is another field experiment. The way we did this field experiment was to create our own social media platform. So it's a open source platform that researchers can use to simulate different types of social media environments. And the idea here is that essentially you can turn on and off different features of social media in order to try to isolate those that might create social cohesion or breed incivility. So what we did is we recruited a large group of people to complete a long survey about their political views, their media consumption habits, a number of other things, as well as their attitudes about immigration and gun control. And then at the end of that survey, we gave them an invite code, which unbeknownst to them, half of them, an invite code that unbeknownst to them, paired them with a member of the other party to chat anonymously about either immigration or gun control. So here you're seeing what the users saw as they kind of came on the platform. And they engaged in a chat for about an hour. And what we saw, here's the research design here. After they chatted for an hour, we resurveyed them with another ostensibly unrelated dialogue. We also collect the text of all the chats. We also have dynamic in-app questions, which pop up at the end of the app, which allowed us to get more kind of merged survey and behavioral measures. And of course, there's just the content of the conversations themselves. So I've read all 800 of these conversations that occurred between the roughly 1,200 people who finally completed the post-survey treatment. So what we found is pretty surprising, or at least surprising to me. We had these two competing hypotheses: either anonymity is going to make things go south quick, or people are going to depolarize. And using a measure of depolarization, which combines a lot of different stuff like affective polarization and ideological polarization, essentially what we see is that people who engaged in an anonymous discussion on our platform exhibited about a 0.3 standard deviation increase in a depolarization index that we created. And they exhibited even higher increases in mean rating or thermometer rating. So this is like 0 to 100. What do you think of the other party? People who engaged in the chat exhibited much more favorable views of the other party. And finally, I'm running out of time, so I'll just go to the last kind of, I think, most interesting finding is that Republicans tended to depolarize at about 6 times the rate of Democrats when we put them in these anonymous chats, suggesting perhaps that escaping peer pressure was particularly important for Republicans in order to find common ground with Democrats. And I think I'm almost over time. Here's the tools I mentioned you can check out on polarizationlab.com. there's the book, and here's how to get a hold of me. And I'd love to hear what you think.
Thank you, Professor Vale. That was a wonderful talk. And let me say that I also enjoyed very much your book, and
thank you.
that actually Princeton University shared discount code that I'm going to put here in the chat for everyone, which is Vale, which is great. And I think, I think everyone should be looking at this work. So now we're going to be joined by some of our conference participants, and we're going to engage in a conversation. We did that yesterday with Professor Coletta and worked wonderfully. So let me just, invite the participants to join the conversation. And let me kick off by asking the following question, which is, you engage in a combination of methods that it's pretty cool in your book, right?
Thanks.
And the way in which you combine sort of interview data with experiments, it's not the usual way in which one usually see that engagement. So, what projects in the future are you thinking about, and how are you thinking to engage methods-wise and combining qualitative with quantitative methods? What are some cool ideas that you have there? And, how are you bringing sociological insights into it, which is also something that you've been doing in this work?
Sure, yeah. Well, I was actually trained by a qualitative scholar, and I'm technically the nephew of Pierre Bourdieu. So, cultural analysis and qualitative work is really near and dear to my heart. And in fact, in my first book, I also combined qualitative interviews with these computational social science approaches. So, in some sense, this is something that I've been kind of excited about for a long time. One thing that was new in this book that I hadn't done before was to, as you say, combine, basically run a qualitative field experiment. And it's interesting. On the one hand, this is extraordinarily complicated, and it's just the resources and scale and time to pull this off. I can't say enough was tremendous. We had a team of 6 interviewers. We had a lot of resources, and it's not an easy thing to do logistically. But the other thing that was difficult as we went to analyze the data is what's the right paradigm to kind of think through experimental data and a qualitative experimental data. Because our first instinct was well, let's run t-tests and or let's think about attrition and all these kind of things. But it's kind of silly to think about treatment effects when you have 80 respondents, but also it's silly to think about treatment effects because you the people. So for example, there's this one case, this man who is kind of moderate Republican, and his attitudes on race moved dramatically the other way. And so he was bucking the trend that we had seen in everybody else, right? He was becoming more attuned to racial injustice and all this kind of stuff. And so we wanted to go see, well, why is this guy not following the trend? And we discovered in the analysis that, he was dating an African-American woman for the first time during the bot period, right? So it completely overrides anything the 10 or 12 bot tweets he might have seen each day, right? And it totally explains what happened, most likely. But with, in our quantitative experiment, that was all just noise, So on the one hand, I think changing our paradigm, but also there were difficult questions of what to do with a control condition, how many comparisons can you make? And ultimately, I think that a difficult decision in writing up the results is kind of how much do you talk about differences between treatment and control. It's difficult to say, well, if this didn't happen in the control and then tell the whole story. It's kind of but it doesn't fit into the mold of qualitative research very well. But I see a huge potential for just, qualitative and quantitative research in general in this realm. I wrote a piece in Theory and Society a few years back, which is now pretty dated, but that's an indication of how quickly this field moves. And that, I think, outlines some ideas I have about how to do this creatively. But yeah, I would love to see sociologists do more experiments, especially in this space of social media and media. to the extent possible. I mean, it's hard to do, and again, it can often require a lot of resources. But there's so many nice examples. Like I really love Clayton Childress's work on reading groups, for example, which has a nice experimental design.
Awesome. So let's start the conversation with our panelists. And so we have Maggie Shan first.
Hi, Professor Bill. It's very exciting for me to listen to your presentation. It's also
thank you.
inspiring for my own research because I used to conduct research related to the effect of engagement with political trolls or propaganda trolls on Twitter, and how it will influence people's attitude and also the discussion. So I also shared my research this morning, and I also say that there is some like similar findings to the one you talked about with one exposure to both and see how the effect of political polarization. So my findings is that even though people are engaging with trolls, but those trolls may have little impact on their behavior and also their attitude on certain topics. So here's my question. So if the effect is like that, if the political parties who use trolls know that their content might not be very effective, then why do they still choose to do so? So if the trolls will have backfire effect or the opposite effect, intention behind such conduct is very like confusing to me right now. So
yeah. Well, first of all, I'm sorry I missed your presentation. I would love to hear more about your research. But I think you're right that the evidence suggests that these political trolling campaigns have minimal effects. I think that the problem is that people don't know that. You know, like a recent survey, there's an interesting study out of the Nieman Center at Berkman Klein Center at Harvard that suggested that, you know, the number of people who think people are influenced by misinformation is just giant. You know, they think like 80% of people are being influenced by misinformation. So in a way that creates this like, it does, you know, you could call that an effect, right? Because then it means that people think that trolling is having an effect on trust or, you know, overall social cohesion or something like that, or maybe a more subtle kind of insidious effect. But I think that means that's why it's so much more urgent for us to correct the misperception that misinformation is having an effect. And I think, you know, the evidence that I've seen most lately points to the misinformation story being very in line with identity warfare. You know, like there's an interesting study coming out in the American Political Science Review, which indicates that it looked at the motivations of people sharing fake news, and one of the things they found is that things like cognitive ability or, you know, all sorts of like personality indicators don't explain much, but desire to take the other side down is like the one thing that seems to really explain what motivates people to share fake news. And that also explains why Republicans share fake news more than Democrats, because they perceive there to be less negative news about Democrats in the media. So I think there's a lot of interesting lines of inquiry here, but I think the main one is just people don't know. I mean, we're investing hundreds of millions of dollars in disinformation research centers right now. And, you know, I mean, now COVID, you know, there's probably new dynamics with COVID that have not been studied enough. So we may yet discover that there are effects, but I think you're right. So far, the evidence suggests the effects have been minimal.
Thank you. We also want to invite our attendees to ask questions in the chat box, and we'll ask them to Professor Vale, or we are going to invite you to ask them if you want to. So, Boyun?
Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation and for the book. It was such a pleasure to read it.
Thanks, I'm glad to hear it.
I wanted to ask you a question in light of what Francesca Poletta told us yesterday during her own keynote. She basically made a wonderful presentation about how social media is giving this sense of intimacy, regardless of whether that was true or not, that created a sense of, you know, a platform, I guess, that is conveying populism and other form of relationship that seem much more intimate and direct. And so my question would be, through this concept of prism, and not as opposed to mirror, you still see that social media can become a platform wherein intimacy is created, right? Because a mirror would be a reflection of who we are, and hence you would have the intimate kind of relationship building. But I believe your concept is wonderful in that sense. Through a prism, you only get a selective idea of what it is. Is intimacy still possible?
Yeah, well, now I'm worried. Now I regret missing Francesca's, apparently brilliant talk, and that's not all surprising to me because she's brilliant. And it's so smart to be asking that question about intimacy. To be honest, it's not one I've thought enough about, but if I can imagine, her take on it from her long, series of works on emotions and politics and social movements, I think she's right that there is a kind of intimacy that's being created. I guess for me, the prism-like effect operates at people kind of misunderstanding what the intimacy means. So for example, like these trolls, who care so much about being accepted, and really the other thing I read about in the book is the kind of cult-like dynamics of trolling communities. And so there's a real, punishment for violating norms and so on. I think the sense of acceptance is really palpable and real, and I think these people might describe it as an important and intimate relationship, but of course it's just some random person, so I think like what's kind of interesting is our inability to, I guess, judge the authenticity of the intimacy. It's it seems like that's something that's really hard to do online, right? If you're in person, you have all these signals of like, is the person looking at me, or is the person listen, did they hear what I said, or all these other types of subtle cues which we might study in person to person contact. But I guess it also, I mean, maybe what she was talking about is more about the connection to populist leaders and feeling like they really care about you, and that we definitely saw in our data. We have a lot of people who say, like, there's a story of a guy in the book, a political troll, who says he writes a letter to President Trump every week, and that's I think an indication of how much intimacy he feels with Trump. Talks about wanting to work in his hotels and how he'd like to wear a MAGA hat but can't afford one. Real deep, sense of connection. Yeah, which we could question whether it's reciprocated, I think, rightly. But these are the types of prism-like effects, I guess I would point to. It's a good question.
Great. I think we have a question from Peter Forberg. Yeah, Peter, please ask the question and stay with your video on as well.
Yeah, sorry, my camera was being a little goofy, so I couldn't turn it on. But I want to again thank you for a wonderful presentation. I think sure. To address something that you brought up was a lot of the conversations at this conference have revolved around some of the dynamics that we've seen with anti-vaxxing and masking with the lockdowns. And so I think your point about how COVID might be changing this, I think identity has really become more prominent in the social outcast in the age of COVID and in this widespread social information. So I think a lot of what you're talking about prior to COVID has great merit for how we can understand this particular political moment. But a question that I have is putting this in conversation with the terrified and the idea of the fringe effect. Is you brought up how most people don't really actively participate in politics online. They're not posting. There's just a wide range of people who kind of passively engage with politics on the internet. So when we have like a minority population like that, how do we understand their influence in the broader kind of public sphere? Do you still believe that it is this leveraging of kind of mainstream resources to get the message out there? How do we translate the effect of this active minority group online as influencing the widespread kind of polarization?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and one that I frankly haven't yet had the chance to think a lot about because of the time between writing books is a huge chasm. But I do see a lot of parallels, I guess, like the way that legacy media amplified these peripheral fringe organizations promoting anti-Muslim messages is really quite similar in a way to the way that social media enables this kind of micro celebrity among these social outcasts. I guess the thing that's a little different is that like the possibility space is so much larger on social media. When I wrote Terrified, the last chapter was almost like an afterthought. It was like, oh my God, all this stuff is happening on social media and we don't understand it yet. And I'm just going to throw a bunch of ideas out there and hope some of them stick. And at the time, you know, I didn't realize, and I think most people didn't realize, like just how the potential for anything to go viral by anyone, you know, and the kind of competition to go viral and how that would create perverse incentives in the political space is something I think we're still all working out. So I think the biggest difference is just how much more open, you know, the competition has become, but at the same time, how much more precious attention has become. You know, so you know you know, if we take the attention economy analogy, which I think is useful for thinking about this, you know, there's just so much less time, you know, less space for anyone to get any kind of attention. So it'd be interesting to think more about how those two dynamics kind of play out in the amplification of fringe messages. But you know, certainly I think similar dynamics in terms of promoting unusual ideas, and it's just the mechanism might be different. It's not, you know, journalistic or your media gatekeepers making these decisions, but you know, all of us clicking, right? I mean, it's like the engagement that is driving this. So even the negative engagement, which of course is an interesting dynamic too. But it's a great question.
Let me insert a question, and then we'll go with Sadie and Shin. So, Professor Bale, your work, you know, it's giving us light on what's happening online, and you know, we've been discussing in this conference also what happens with the organizational component offline, right? So, with these extremists, and you know, how are they organizing online? What's your perspective on the connection? You know, Peter's work on QAnon and how people are being engaged in QAnon, but you know, people on QAnon are also actively organizing offline in some ways. So I would like to know your opinion on this sort of online-offline bridge.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. When I started writing about social media and social movements, you know, this was years ago, like 5 or 6 years ago, like the big concern was that everything online was just slacktivism, you know, that, and like our conversation for about 3 or 4 years was like, nothing on social media matters. And now, I mean, the situation is quite different. And, but anyways, I guess the reason I brought that up is just thinking about, you know, how vivid, you know, events like, January 6th are right now. Like clearly, you know, social media played a role, Reddit played a role, you know, Facebook played a role, Twitter played a role. You know, I think one thing that's really understudied is Facebook groups and the capacity of especially non-public groups to channel stuff. It's such a huge challenge though. How do you study this stuff? You know, I mean, in some sense, you know, this is where I think qualitative research could be useful because, you know, we simply don't know how people connect. I mean, one of the surprising things in my research was just how much people kind of coordinate with each other. So like, you know, these follow back kind of dynamics, but then also like offline events. You know, the challenge that I think, like, you know, I remember getting into an interesting conversation about the Facebook leak that disclosed that, you know, in Germany, a lot of people who are a member of one extremist page are also, you know, subscribing to another extremist page. And so, you know, the thought is that then Facebook is somehow enabling the spread of extremism. But, you know, it'd be really interesting to know, like, are those people actually developing more extreme views? Are they acting offline in different ways? There's some interesting work on this online offline dynamic among white supremacist communities by Magdalena Wojciak, who's a political scientist at UC Santa Barbara, I think, or UC Irvine, maybe. And she's just done some probably the best work I've seen on it. But yeah, I think it's really hard to know. I mean, how do you do the mapping of the organizational infrastructure? You know, I mean, you know, years ago, I would say, you know, look at like nonprofit filings, like, you know, or IRS data, but there's so much gray space in between these official organizations and what a movement or organization means anymore is really interesting. Jennifer Earle had some interesting papers 4 or 5 years ago about kind of leaderless movements, you know, and I think that's like a really interesting dynamic, especially something like QAnon. Like, what is QAnon? You know, it's probably at that definitional stage. I don't know if you struggle with that, Peter, to say what, how do you draw the boundaries of the movement? That's certainly something I struggled with even in studying anti-Muslim groups, because they're so diffuse and they kind of they're international, and how do you start to say who's really believes in QAnon and who doesn't, and who's providing the organizational infrastructure? These are things that I think we'll be studying for a long time.
So Sadie and Sheen, and I encourage the participants, the attendees, to also ask questions, and we'll bring them in.
Cool, awesome. Thanks so much for your talk. So this question's kind of going back to some of the earlier questions. I was definitely struck by how you described how you ended up finding trolls in your sample and how the interview content was so different from what they see on Twitter. And that's something that I think we see a lot in this research, is that there's a nature of like social media that's performative and that has all of these different elements that just kind of like regular interactions don't have. And yet those intimate relationships, those personal relationships, those things are so important for how, especially like normal, for less of a better word, like not politically extreme or super engaged people make sense of politics, even if they don't think about it as political. And obviously, like you mentioned, one solution in like an ideal world would be maybe like unplug from Twitter, but that's not realistic. And then I want to hear more about your interventions and kind of your ideas, because obviously like an anonymous social platform where you kind of structure it so that people can't necessarily accumulate any type of social capital from these kind of chat interactions in your kind of intervention is also so different from like the social media world we live in. I guess I would love to hear more about how you're thinking about these types of interventions, either online or offline, and kind of what that looks like, how to move forward.
Do you mean interventions to discourage extremism, or which kind of interventions?
Yeah, so I was thinking about, at the very end of your talk, you showed how you did one experiment where you put people into chats with people who,
right.
That's the experiment that I'm.
Oh, okay. Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's an interesting question. We, first of all, just to give you some sense of some of the complexity of running these kinds of experiments, like to create so we told people they were helping us test a real social media platform. And in a sense they were, because we built a social media platform, and we but what that meant, we had to like staff a user support staff and have content moderators and all this kind of stuff. So we were particularly worried about trolling in the app. And basically what we did was we built a tool. Google uses this tool for detecting hate speech. It's called the Perspective API, and it's a tool that you can pass text through, and then it will send a score of how toxic it is. Basically, doesn't really work very well, but basically we use that to flag conversations that were potentially problematic, and then I would get an email if a conversation was going south, and then we had like a button that would shut down or a button in our software backend that would shut down the conversation. And I was like, I had cleared my schedule for the week, and we had like, graduate students were staffing me and the graduate students were staffing, and we were going back and forth about all these decisions. It was really like, gave me an appreciation for content moderation, I'll tell you. But what was most surprising is we had so few cases that needed moderation. So I would have guessed that people would have been trolling each other all over. I mean, this is recruited from pool of people who take surveys on the internet. I would think they would be very savvy internet trolls if that was their prerogative, right? I think the thing though that's interesting is you have to think about the motivations of trolls and what's the motivation for incivility. And like, if it is status, then I think what you have to do is think about how to, change the status incentives so that they make it less fun for trolls to play. Like you want to kind of, reward things like people who, express messages that are appreciated by different types of people, or, you want to change the goals of the platform itself. A troll wants to go on Twitter because they can get people all riled up, and get likes and followers for doing that, right? But if they are on a platform where it's, the primary goal is like, convincing the other side about the merits of a claim, and granted, this is a very niche community, and this isn't a solution to all trolling on the internet whatsoever. But I think like if we put it in the bigger picture, like I think there's kind of always been a kind of trolling, you know, it might be hecklers in a crowd, you know, it'd be interesting to do a sociological analysis of how that kind of incivility has emerged. I mean, certainly it's, maybe it's increased during the internet. I wouldn't be surprised if it has. But you know, the interesting thing though, yeah, is we didn't see a lot of incivility from the intervention. We actually only had to shut down one conversation. I will say though that conversation was horrendously racist and terrible. So it's not as if this is like a, you know, panacea solution. And I think if you made Facebook anonymous tomorrow, it would be a disaster. But that's because the status incentives are misaligned, I think.
Yeah, we have Xin and Jishen next.
Thank you for your presentation, Professor.
Sure.
I presented my research on the state mobilization and the digital self-governance in China's COVID-19 response yesterday. So cool. I realized that after COVID-19, like on the social media, there are actually different patterns of collaborations. Like we also discussed with panelists yesterday about some of them may have a central node, like centralized collaboration, but some of them may be headless, or they just decentralized and distributive collaborations. So I wonder if you ever like explore the influence of the social media on the like patterns of collaborations in the social movements online. And the second question, sorry, I have a second question. Okay, the second question is about because my research is actually focuses on the state society and state business engagement. So I want, especially in such kind of a context, when like in the US, former President Trump's Twitter can be banned by Twitter. So, but in other authoritarian countries, maybe the government or the party want to use the digital platforms and the big tech firms to try to use their data information and to try to do some state building or party building efforts through the platforms. So you can see that there are different like patterns of state society or state business engagement in the social media. So yeah, I want to know your like insights into this. Like, thank you very much.
I would love to see just so much more work internationally about all these issues. Like the work that stands out to me on this issue is Alexandra Siegel's work, Siegal. She's a political scientist at UC Boulder, and then Jennifer Pan's work from Stanford, who's in communications and political science. And you know, both of them I think have done really interesting work on authoritarianism and social media. You know, Jen has this interesting new paper that was presented, I think, at the Summer Institutes 2 years ago. There's a video if you want to see it online on our YouTube channel that you know, looked at these different kind of typologies of you know, different types of authoritarian actors. So she has some evidence from Saudi Arabia and from China, and she was using, I think, primarily the Twitter's elections integrity hub data, which for those of you who don't know is this wonderful resource. Basically, it's a data archive of all the accounts that Twitter takes down. That I think could be an enormous enormously generative source of analysis for the strategies. I mean, really, I mean, obviously we can't always tell about things like influence or coordination from looking at the tweets, but like to do a mapping of the strategies, like what was the authoritarian state trying to do, I think it's a really interesting thing. The other data that I always thought was underutilized, when several years ago, I wrote a paper with Andreas Wimmer and Taylor Brown about using Google search data to try to look at some global diffusion trends. And while we were collecting the data for that project, we had to collect a censorship variable, and Google has this wonderful data set of like all requests for censorship, and then it's broken down by country and by private or public, and then a number of the content that was requested to be taken down. it's just really interesting because it seems to me that it would provide a kind of idea of how authoritarian regimes are approaching, censoring social media in particular. I don't know that it can be broken down by social media. That would be too bad if it can't. But these are kind of like nice digital trace data, because I wonder if the states realize that when they request for something to be taken down, it's going to be taken down. The other thing is there's a ton of requests to take stuff down from the U.S. government, which is also kind of interesting too. To think about. I mean, we tend to think of this as a problem of authoritarian states, but maybe it's a broader issue, at least according to the data that we saw. A challenge, of course, is like the different types of social media platforms in different types of places. Weibo or Vocatant or any of the other kind of like non-Twitter related. And I think in general we're so focused on Twitter because it's the easiest data to collect and analyze. So certainly there's a really interesting questions you're thinking about. Your first question about online collaboration leading to offline networks. I haven't done the research really to show. I mean, from my first book, there's some suggestive evidence that like media connections were creating the potential for social network connections. Saw some of that in the qualitative data for that book. But I don't, I really haven't been focused on mobilization questions in the last 3 years. So I haven't really been keeping up with the literature. So I don't have a great answer, I guess, for this question. And I haven't seen it in our data, unfortunately.
Yeah, can I ask a follow-up question about
Sure, Shane, and then we'll have Jishan. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So
Sure.
When I do the research using the online data about the different digital platforms, I use the process tracing method, but there are a lot of things or events going on at the same time online. So when you use it's a methodology question. When you use the process tracing, you need to focus on the sequence of events. So I wonder, can you give us some suggestions on using, choosing or using different methods when we try to do some causal inference, with a sequence of events. If we want to show that this events lead to this rather than this events lead to this. So how to better defend ourselves?
I see. So you're doing work with process tracing. You're getting a lot of questions about causality and how do you respond? Yeah, that's tough. I to some degree I can sympathize, because I especially with my first book, a lot of the account is an evolutionary process, so one way to respond, I think, is to kind of point to the, it's not really the right question to ask about an evolutionary model or a process-based model, because the goal isn't necessarily to explain generalizable causal patterns, but how you get to point B from point A. But certainly it's a little bit of a cop-out, because then people can say, well, yeah, but something else might be causing point B. I don't think I have a brilliant idea about how to except just very carefully entertaining alternative explanations on a case-by-case basis. That's kind of how I tried to handle that type of objection. But I don't know of a single method or a data source or something like that. I think on the other hand, there is I'm thinking back to sequence analysis and stuff like that. And one of the limitations of that tradition, I think early on, was there wasn't a lot of data. So maybe the trick is to sample more sequences rather than going deeper into one. If you have, multiple chapters of a dissertation, you go in deep to one, do the process tracing, but then you pull out to see if you can find those patterns in a much bigger sample. I think that might be convincing to people too. But what constitutes the sequence, and of course finding the important parts of the sequence, is what you need to do the in-depth reading for. And I don't know that there's text analysis tools that are really well equipped to do that, but I'm reminded of Peter Bierman and Jim Moody and Hannah Bruckner's old work on blocking the future. This is an interesting network analysis of oral history interviews, and to some extent they ask these interesting questions about, they think of nodes in a network as events in a sequence, and then they do this interesting experiment in the paper where they think about okay, now you simulate very different arrangements of events and see how much they disrupt the story at the aggregate level across lots of different individuals. So I guess that's an interesting model to think with. I mean, it'd be interesting to think of like writing that blocking the future paper with Twitter data, for example, or maybe not everybody uses Twitter data, but maybe, I don't know, Reddit data or something, you know, some other kind of analysis would be really cool.
You're next.
Thank you, Professor Bell, for the wonderful speech you gave. And
sure, yeah, pleasure.
And also because I am from a very different background, actually. I have a background in cultural studies, and which is quite different and remote from the field of your like quantitative research. So I always in awe of like doing these complicated analysis by quantitative methods. But still, I want to challenge some limits of these quantitative methods from my like academic stance. I don't know how to put it, but yeah.
Sure,
but the first one is about the anonymity you talked about. You mentioned in your speech. You said like the good side of this anonymity is that it makes people focus more on topics and discussions rather than identities, right? But I just wonder whether you have thinking of like doing comparisons between different between people from different cultures. Like for example, just look at all the profile image of all the panelists here. Like I'm the only one who use a cartoon or animation as my profile page, but others, like most people, they use their real man, like real person photos, right? It's because I studied Japanese culture, and I was deeply affected by it. I was like raised in that kind of culture, but like people get educated or raised or born in different cultures, they will use like they will like perform themselves online quite differently. And this is kind of this is so it will like using different profile photos. I think it will affect this like focus on identities, right? Because it's quite obvious out there. So this is my first question. And the second one is about like also it's actually related to image. Like how like I just wonder like how will you use quantitative analysis to analyze non-text information carriers in this online environment? Like for example, there is one of my I have an intended research topic about emoji. I don't know whether you know this emoji, and it's like you click the reaction button in the Zoom and you will see some like facial.
Yeah, I'm not that old. Yeah, I'm pretty old, but not that old.
Okay, so like because like this kind of things you actually it's not like text languages. I guess you can't just quantify it first at the first place. Second, a lot of languages and lots of expressions they got changed. The tone and the actual meaning got changed because of the emoji and other like emoticons they use in their tweets or like. So if you use like quantitative methods, and will you kind of retort the actual meaning of these people? I just wonder,
they're really good questions. I think just to validate something you said in general, like I think we underappreciate the role of images in shaping all sorts of outcomes, and there's a big gap in especially the sociological literature. There's some older traditions of visual sociology, but they haven't really been connected to political sociology or media sociology, I think, in really compelling ways. So I think you're absolutely right that, you know, the media, the imagery is something that we're missing. But I think I would say you can't, it's not that you can only look at those with close readings. So I agree that in general, if you were dropped into an internet conversation, wanted to make sense of it, and you could choose either you with your cultural analysis tools or someone else with a topic model, like absolutely, I would want to hear you know, like, the tools are primitive, and especially as you say, a topic model would only, which is a form of automated text analysis, would only look at the words, right? But at the same time, I think there's enormous potential for experimentation with imagery. So one thing that we've done on our new social media platform, so our social media platform can kind of be like repurposed for lots of different studies. And so we did this really, I think it's one of the coolest studies we've done. We're studying the Democratic primary and looking at who influences who among Democrats for their preferred candidate. So, you know, we basically recruited people to have these same kind of chats, but they're trying to influence each other's vote, basically. And what we did is we randomized people to either have a female avatar or a male avatar, but it was fully random. So like basically there's this video that they see where they see this like little avatar circling around, and then it zooms in on one that's either male or female. And the interesting thing, of course, is like in effect, we're turning men into women and women into men, at least as their other partner sees them at first. And so the questions are like, how are these visuals to some extent? I mean, really, you could say it's gender, whatever gender means, but you could say that the visuals are part of this story, right? So the interesting thing is then you can say, you know, how do people talk differently to a man they think is a woman, or a woman they think is a man, right? So there's a way to, in other words, like experiment with the images themselves that I think can produce different types of text content. And obviously we were interested in how it shapes people's voting behaviors. But, you know, I think that's an interesting, so I would say yes, cultural analysis is very much needed and it's a good road into studying images. But I wouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, with experiments. You know, I think there are really interesting things that can be done with experiments and images. Yeah.
Thanks. We have a question from Nisar Mehta. It's a bit of a long question, so bear with me as I read it. During an earlier panel, Andreas Glaser noted that even though we tend to still conceive of the digital public sphere in Habermasian terms, it might be better referred to as fragmented. You've also discussed the failure of thinking of social media in these Habermasian terms. And the metaphor of social media as a frame also calls to mind exactly this kind of fragmentary public. I'm wondering how we might extend these metaphors to platforms themselves. That is to say, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter are different forms of social media with different affordances. And certainly, users often say they wouldn't use Facebook for the same thing they would use Instagram. The meme counter-posting profile photos for LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, and Tinder comes to mind. States tend to do the same. The BJP in India, for example, uses these official channels, Twitter and WhatsApp, in very different ways for different messaging. WhatsApp in particular has been really powerful in India for a variety of reasons.
Yeah.
I'm wondering to what extent the social process you've described in your talk today and book might require different approaches given this platform fragmentation in the digital public sphere.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think cross-platform research is very underdeveloped. And by the way, I've heard this not just from, well, actually, I don't hear it from sociologists enough at all, but especially from political scientists, communication scholars. Like, I think there's a real gap here. And I think you're absolutely right. There's different types of presentations of self on different types of platforms. You know, I always say to my students, like, you know, how many of you are on Instagram? Everybody raise their hand. How many are on Facebook? And then everybody raised their hand. And it's like, so tell me, you know, is there any difference between what's on Facebook and Instagram? They're all like, yes. Like my parents are on Facebook, right? So it profoundly shapes what's done on Facebook, right? Or like, you know, whatever, TikTok or Clubhouse or whatever, you know, whatever you kids are using these days. So absolutely want to validate the kind of, you know, the need for more research on cross-platform stuff. We did in our research, even though the experiment was Twitter focused, one of the nice things about the qualitative data is we could talk to people about different platforms. So like we talk about experiences in Facebook or I talk about experiences in Facebook on the book. You know, we don't, most of the coverage is Facebook versus Twitter. And like, certainly there are the type of dynamics that this question raises, like, you know, the publicness of the platform. But I also think like yes, there are affordances that are different, but then the other thing that was shocking from our qualitative research is how people often don't understand the differences across the platform. So like, you know, we'd have people saying like, you know, like they don't understand that Twitter is public, or they don't understand that like Facebook, you know, is closed, or they have these crazy, you know, understandings that like a fake account replying from Nancy Pelosi to them is not really Nancy Pelosi. You know, they just like digital literacy is something that I think is really understudied, and like, and especially as like older people use social media. I think Esther Hargitay has some interesting new work on this and old work too, actually. So like starting to think about, yeah, these different presentations of self on different platforms is a really interesting question. I think like, you know, if there was one thing I would have loved to have, it would be like people's Facebook data. But of course, you know, one can't get that anymore. You can talk to them about it, but you can't, you know, you can't get it at scale. But I think like even just, you know, maybe comparing Facebook or Twitter and Reddit, you know, which are two very available data sources, you know, it'd be interesting to see work that compares those two, because they vary to some degree in the amount of anonymity, the amount of publicness, and so on.
So we have Keynote now.
Thank you so much for your awesome talk. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks.
My question is actually on related to Yi-Chen's question on anonymity. So you mentioned that anonymity could actually be beneficial. It could give people a wiggle room to express ideas that are not strictly associated with previously expressed online identity. So like, yes, if I put I'm a climate activist, but then, or like, yeah, let's say I put, you know, I'm a progressive, but then I may not be totally in line with the defund the police movement. So I could make another anonymous account and then express my opinions, let's say, for example. So, you know, from a researcher perspective, how do you think there are ways for us researchers to sort of explore this various identities that may be dispersed across the web, and understand then how then that's affecting one's views, or is influencing one's views to be less polarized? That's one of my questions. And then so my second question is on sort of Nancy Bain's idea that affordances are socio-technological because reflect social reality. So I was wondering, we do a lot of research on Facebook, Twitter, that's actually less anonymous than websites like 4chan and Reddit. So, and then the weird thing is, though, even though 4chan and Reddit, they're more anonymous, they're based on more anonymity, they tend to be really toxic because, of course, reflecting the social reality, but there's definitely gender vitriol in those places, more gender vitriol in those places as well, like, I think. And so I was wondering then, is there a way for, and I was wondering, like, in that case, like, is the anonymity sort of the issue? What could be the issue there? Yeah, what could be the issue there? And I guess my third question is, I really enjoyed through your qualitative experiment, we had like a one-on-one chat where I had like people do one-on-one chat, and they were actually really, you know, like, it was actually, it proved to be really effective in sort of depolarizing the both parties' opinions. And I was wondering if it has to do with less about anonymity, but more with like one-on-one person sort of conversational situation, which I don't know if you know, but Braver Angels is like a website that lets you with like person with a different opinion. They do be conversational guide, which I thought was really interesting. I'm not sure if that is totally anonymous, or if I think that they have to turn their camera on when they're speaking. I'm not really sure, but like, I was wondering then, where's the room for anonymity here? Is it something related to anonymity? What about, and is anonymity related to this? And how can anonymity relate with the space that you provide?
Yeah. Raphael, we can't hear you. Oh, wait.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry, my headphones died here. Yes, great questions. The first thing, this, whether it's anonymity or the peer-to-peer thing, yeah, I think we don't know. So I think that's a really interesting question for future research. It could also be a third thing too, which is just moving the conversation to a new place, you know, where like there aren't yet norms. So I think we need a ton more research on all of that. The comment about Reddit being like really toxic and 4chan being toxic, 4chan is definitely very toxic. Reddit, I think, is interesting though, because on the one hand, yes, like red pill is terribly toxic and some of the worst stuff on the internet. But then you have like Change My View, which I think is like a shining example of like what's possible. Like it's probably some of the most civil discussion about politics on Reddit. Some of that's probably moderation, right? There's interesting work by J. Nathan Mathias about this role of moderation, and I think it's really underappreciated. So like, it could be that moderation is part of it. It could be, that these communities just attract different types of people. There's different selection of it. I mean, like, not a lot of people who don't want to change their minds go to Change My View because it's called Change My View. So I think there's that whole dynamic is really interesting. But yeah, I think one of the things I really wanted to do that didn't pan out is Braver Angels, when they started that initiative, they were working in part with NPR's StoryCorps, which you may know is like, that's the thing where like people record an interview with people and it gets archived at the Library of Congress. And so actually StoryCorps, we were all in the same Washington Post article, and we started a conversation between all of us afterwards. And I really, really wanted to do a study with this so you could do like this peer-to-peer interviewing thing. But basically what happened is, we wanted to like randomize people and control who was going to talk to who for all the interesting sociological questions. And they were like, yeah, no, like that's not how this works. Like they have a customized, and and it's a good reason, like they really carefully think about who's going to work with who. And they don't want conversations to go south, which is very reasonable, and that's their mission, is to create good outcomes. So I don't know that, but the other opportunity was through COVID, because as soon as COVID hit, I was like, oh my God, they're going to be doing this on video now, and we can do all these interesting comparisons. But yeah, we didn't get to do it. So maybe one of you can pull it off.
Let me insert myself, and we'll go with Jishan and Peter. So, Professor Bale, I was in light of the attack on the Capitol, and people migrating from Facebook to Parler, and the idea that maybe a conservative community was going to be formed on Parler. I was wondering about sort of this hyper fragmentation of the space, and sort of what if we start to have our own islands that are so separated. But your book makes me wonder if that's really something that we could think about happening, because the issue of the status has to do so much also with the interplay with someone that is different, and sort of the ones that support you, that sort of crowding and sort of applauding you for attacking maybe the other side. That it seems to me that this logic that you described in social media may also require sort of a bit of an interaction between different people. What do you think about this?
So you mean that the role of social media was to put different types of people into contact with each other, and that might interrupt the kind of status dynamics that I was talking about?
I think that the forming of the status that you described might be closely intertwined with sort of being able to attack the other side. And so if you don't have the other to attack, I think that game of the status seeking might not play out. And so therefore it doesn't make a lot of sense to think of a platform that's going to be sort of exclusively liberal or exclusively conservative, because the game of status is not there.
Oh yeah, I don't know. I'm that may be true. I could also see the opposite being true, though. I mean, one of the interesting things that Parler did, for example, is created these badges. Have you been following this? So like, I haven't really studied Parler much, but there's two interesting working papers out. One is by the Stanford Internet Observatory, and the other is by a group of computer scientists at Boston University. I can't remember the author's name. But one of the interesting things, it seems like Parler was giving people these badges that are like, but nobody knows why, where they came from or how they were allocated and stuff like that, except that people seem to really care about these badges, So like, I think that underscores, though, that it's not so much about, it's not always just about taking the other side down, but like signaling to your side that you're the most extreme. I mean, I think so many of us want to answer the question of like, what's going to happen if social media becomes compartmentalized by ideology. But I just, I could really see it going both ways. You could say, well, it's just going to quarantine the most politically active, ideologically extreme people, and that might not have a big effect. In fact, it might make the mainstream platforms better because then the moderates will stay, and you'll see less, incivility. But of course, you can tell the other story that maybe you're telling too, that maybe it'll just fizzle out because there's no point. Like, what's the point if you're not taking down the other side? But if you look at parlor discourse, it's a lot of taking down the other side still. It's just there's no owning the libs, right? Because it's all just sharing stuff that's criticizing liberals.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yichen and Peter.
Sorry, I forgot to put my hands down.
No problem.
I have a question about a part of your book that once I'm able to get my hands on it, I'll be interested in reading about. Is this kind of undermining the prevailing theory about algorithms and the role of algorithms in echo chambers and self-segregation. I think there's a very interesting work from the anthropologist Nick Seaver about conceptions of algorithms, either in culture or as culture. And something that I've seen a lot with my own research on QAnon is the way that it's not so much that these algorithms are in culture pushing people into these various extremist groups, but that more so these algorithms reflect the ways that we've always self-segregated and the ways that we've always radicalized. And so I'm just wondering about the distinction there in saying, well, algorithms still do, at least from the experience that I've had, algorithms still do play a large role, but it's the same question about, is it the math that's racist in some of these algorithms, or is it the data source? And if we're saying the data source is human behavior and humans' tendency to do these various racist or segregating things or extremist things, then the algorithm is just an affordance that allows for the reproduction of kind of those social behaviors.
Yeah. The Sendhil Mullainathan, the economist, made a very similar argument in some recent work that he published in Science on racism and medical algorithms that allocate medical care. And he gave a talk about that at our summer institutes in 2018, which is also on the YouTube channel. If you're interested in his take, it's not really getting into the cultural side of algorithms, but this human behavior or math, which one is it? Is it weapons of math destruction, or is it, just good old fashioned human behavior? I think I fall much more on the human behavior side. I think the first thing I would say is we don't have enough research. Like, we don't have access to, we don't even know how the algorithms work mostly. So like to study it is a little bit crazy, but I think the best studies out there, I think Brendan Nyan, who's a political scientist at Dartmouth, has some interesting web tracking data. So he's got like this large panel of people and knows every website they visited, and then has these multiple surveys over time. And what he saw in that analysis is that only less than 2% of people progressed from moderate content to radical content in a significant way. So, I mean, and that could just be noise too, right? Like, it's hard to know so I think the caricature that's out there, and like, if you've seen like the Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma, is that like social media has this godlike power that operates on us all and injects opinions into us. But it's not at all surprising that a bunch of like former tech engineers are going to say, oh, engineering is powerful and computer science is powerful, right? A lot of the research just doesn't pan that out. And the thing that's compelling to me is like, it's actually really consistent with political communication literature for the last 50 years, right? Nothing works. Like, campaigns don't work. Media campaigns don't work. Micro-targeting doesn't work. Like, none of it works. It's because like, it's really hard to change someone's mind. I think the thing that people then extrapolate to this, well, people are profiting from the algorithms and that's why they must be doing this. And it's like, there's not even evidence really that corporations are profiting. Of course, we wouldn't know. I mean, that's another big problem. So again, I think more than anything else, we need better data. But look out for a new working paper from the New York University Center for Social Media and Politics. They also have a new experiment with algorithms, and that I'm not sure is public yet, but it's going to be an interesting addition to the story and along the lines that I'm describing.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Yes, Boyun, we yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I actually had a question that was unrelated to the discussion, but I just wanted to react quickly to that prior to asking my question is, I think maybe this dichotomy between is it the machine or is it the people might be oversimplifying the question in that there might be a structure to it as well, right? That is actually in between the machine and the people, using and, you know, kind of caricaturing that a little bit. A Marxist would say that maybe technology is reshaping the modes of production because now the product is something very different, right? You've mentioned the Social Dilemma kind of sensationalizing documentary that was on Netflix. They basically mention how now, you know, they're productifying people's attention, and the capital hence is no longer the product, but something that's very intangible. So maybe this dichotomization that just juxtaposes the human and the algorithm might be missing the structure, if not the cultural kind of apparatus beneath, like that surrounds it. So
I definitely agree that the dichotomy is not helpful, and I definitely agree that the interaction is the most interesting thing that we need to understand better. The only thing I would wonder is whether Marxism is the best way to think about it, because, like, you know, on the one hand, you know, like these books, like, you know, the Surveillance in the Age of who am I thinking of? The Harvard professor, Surveillance Capitalism. What's the name of the book? Surveillance Capitalism. Do you know this book?
Yeah, Surveillance.
Okay. You know, I think it's a little facile in its analysis. You know, like there's not a lot of, I mean, again, the problem is we don't have the data, but like, I haven't seen the data that suggests that I agree that there is an effort to commodify attention, but whether that is then generating a second order effect is something that I think we don't have evidence of. So I think like a more interesting way maybe to approach it is like maybe through something like Ian Hacking's concept of looping, or some kind of like, you know, because it's like, it's more like if it I think that it like, if it shapes the space of possibilities in an interesting way, you know, that's like, that to me, that's a little more, rather than this kind of like, we're all trapped in this, you know, like, you know, the idea that social media users don't have agency is, you know, that seemed like, look at Tahrir Square, look at January 6th, look at, you know, like there's so many cases like, you know, I mean, you could argue, I'm sure we could do a Marxist reading of all those cases too, but it just seems like maybe that the back and forth, yeah, I mean, I don't know, I've been following with great interest, Marianne Fourcade-Greenshaw's has some new work on algorithms that's on my reading list, but I haven't, you know, haven't gotten to it yet, but I would suspect she's thinking really smartly in this space. But I think you're absolutely right. The dichotomy isn't really useful. It's not useful to say this or that. Yeah.
Yeah, so if I may just ask the question that I wanted to ask
yeah,
you.
Sure.
So
Yeah,
it really
sorry,
comes back to this idea. I wanted to juxtapose your science paper published recently with the 2017 ASR, the Channeling Hearts and Minds.
Oh, yeah. Wow.
And I was
I've never tried to reconcile.
Yeah, no, because I think while the connection might not be obvious, I wanted to ask you if you would update the conclusion from the 2017 ASR about the ebbs and flows in light of maybe social media and data analytics. And if I remember correctly, I think the ASR paper was drawing on 2011, 2012 data. And I was wondering, in light of the rise and spread of data analytics and the algorithm and all of those discussions since then, whether you would see a different shape of the ebb and flows.
Oh, like our algorithm shaping that flow?
Yeah.
Or how, yeah. I mean, this is the problem with published articles. You can't update them, right? Yeah, I do think, yeah, that would be interesting to think about. I mean, you know, it's hard to know, again, like, you know, the emotional contagion study, I think that Facebook ran, like, I'm sure at some level they were trying to ask this question of whether they should downrank depressing content or something like that, or, you know, I mean, although I shouldn't say that because I don't know that that came from inside the company. I mean, I know the investigator who started, the Stanford professor who started the project, and he just really seemed to be out to test the theory of emotional contagion. But like, yeah, if we think about that and the potential for algorithms to amplify that, yeah, and it might not even be, as you were saying earlier, I mean, this interaction, like it might not really be that the algorithm is amplifying for emotions, but amplifying directly through engagement or something like that. You know, so like you just have something gets retweeted because it's emotional, which then the algorithm may be agnostic to the tone of the text, but just that it's been retweeted a lot, then boosts it. Yeah, it's really interesting. I think, you know, there's all these other, you know, it's just interesting to think generatively, like theoretically about algorithms, but it's also interesting to think like in terms of like the methodology too, because like these algorithms are probably interfering with our experiments in very complicated ways too. So yeah, I wish, you know, I really wish we could get some kind of independent audit of how algorithms work, but I guess, you know, they're business secrets, you know. I have some undergraduate students who've been doing some interesting work with TikTok, and it's interesting to think about like how, you know, like if you think about it, because there the question of like attention that was asked earlier is really interesting, right? Like if the algorithm is trying to determine how long I'm spending on each video, then in weird ways that might, you know, optimize for unfamiliar content, you know, like so like it's like, imagine you're going on to TikTok and you're a Republican, and on Twitter you only see stuff from other Republicans, and then you get on Facebook or TikTok, and one of the first few videos you're shown is like trying to figure out your politics essentially, and then you see a Democratic, you know, whatever TikTok, and you might watch it at length just because you're like, who are these people? I've never seen this before. So like in the political space, that could have really weird implications, right? It could like suddenly it could give you like a really heavy dose of the other side. You know, I don't think we know anything about that type of exposure. We don't know a lot about politics on TikTok in general. But yeah, you know, I suspect we're going to be talking, I mean, because like it's fundamentally a question about how this social architecture or the architecture of the platforms incentivizing different types of behavior, right? And I think like this is a prime example of like, we can't ask, like when I said earlier, like we can't ask the fundamental questions about how the design of social media platforms shapes human behavior because we can't get in the platforms to run these experiments. Well, maybe like on our platform, you could run some experiments that actually you know, build algorithms, different kinds of algorithms, like hypothetical algorithms, right? We wouldn't really know, you know, but you could do an algorithm that optimizes for attention and one that optimizes for diversity and one that, you know, it'd be really interesting to then have people use it for a month and see what happens. But building those things out, I mean, this platform we built is like a year of coding just to build the platform. So the good news, like we actually have a pending grant with the National Science Foundation that would allow us to open source all this. And then hypothetically other people could like, you know, like we were messing like with this gender thing that I was mentioning earlier and whatever, but like hypothetically the randomization could be different algorithms, but then you need to build in a news feed, which we don't have on the platform right now. You know, but like I think if we had these places to do science outside of the platforms a little more effectively, it would be really useful.
Great. So, well, time has flown by and we've reached the end. And there is a lot of people that I want to thank that have made this conference work so well. So thank you, Professor Chris Bale, for your wonderful keynote and conversation. Thank you to the panelists for some wonderful engagement in the last 2 days. We also have to thank the discussants for some truly excellent comments. Francesca Poletta for her wonderful keynote and presentation yesterday. The tech team and the Sociology department, the Chicago Center on Democracy that have made this conference possible. And finally, I want to especially thank Anna, Berg, and Nisarg Mehta, with whom we have coordinated this conference and has been a wonderful team to work with. With this, we have reached the end. and see you next time.